I said in our State of the City speech, quote, our young people don't need to be policed, they need to be reached. And that is the spirit of the reforms we're going to talk about today and beyond. We will be moving funding from the NYPD to youth initiatives and social services. The details will be worked out in the budget process in the weeks ahead. But I want people to understand that we are committed to shifting resources to ensure that the focus is on our young people. And I also will affirm, while doing that, we will only do it in a way that we are certain continues to ensure that this city will be safe.
So what you just saw there was Bill de Blasio, mayor of New York City, saying for the first time that he is committed to cutting funding from the NYPD and moving resources over to youth and social services. Now, this is really big news, and it signals a massive shift in policy and in position from even just a few days ago. Even just on Friday, de Blasio was expressing skepticism to the idea of cutting police budgets. But of course, this follows after 10 successive nights of massive protest against police violence, and as demands continue to mount from activists and from protesters. But it's actually not just from activists and protesters. I want to show you this open letter, which got sent from a bunch of staffers for the Bill de Blasio administration, both current and former staffers to Bill de Blasio. So I'm just going to sort of read the headline here to you guys because the actual letter is a little bit longer, but you can see here, this is a letter written by current and former staffers of the de Blasio administration, and there's a bunch of signatures down at the bottom. Outraged by the brutality perpetuated by the NYPD during the recent protests against police violence and by the mayor's refusal to criticize the NYPD for that brutality, we are demanding that the mayor implement 4 policy reforms which live up to its progressive values that he speaks of. So this is really exciting, obviously. In that letter, shortly after, obviously, that sort of pressure from the letter, helped move de Blasio on the issue because he was quite sort of skeptical about cutting police budgets initially. Now, what's interesting is that when de Blasio first got into office, he actually was quite interested in implementing a lot of police reforms. But you'll remember shortly after 2 officers were shot in a cop car in New York City and de Blasio attended a funeral, you'll remember that all the police officers, basically from the police union, turned their backs on de Blasio, turned their backs and said, "We don't support you, de Blasio," when de Blasio was going up to speak at a police funeral, essentially signaling that de Blasio was against the police, and that was, as a result, that was obviously very bad press, and de Blasio since then has been walking the line a lot more tightly when it comes to the police. So to see de Blasio turning back around to some of the rhetoric that he was first running on when he initially got into office in, I think, like 2013, is really exciting to see de Blasio coming back around, at least to the extent that he is. We don't know exactly how much he's going to cut yet. He hasn't quite announced that. He said that the negotiations are ongoing and that he'll be coming out in the next couple days, hopefully in the next week or so, to give us more sort of detailed information about this. Now, the other person who's been really significant in putting a lot of pressure on de Blasio, surprisingly, is AOC. We've seen AOC, this is a sort of story on her Instagram, a screenshot of her story on Instagram, talking about the issue of defunding police. And the thing is, when AOC talks about defunding police, she always uses New York City as the example, obviously being a representative from New York City. She talks about and focuses in on how the budget of New York City is over $6 billion, which is more than the amount of money that they spend on youth, on housing, on healthcare, and on homelessness combined. New York City spends way more money on actually just, stopping crime when it happens, as opposed to on the things that could prevent crime from ever happening in the first instance, in the first case. And one of the things, sort of the rhetorical methods, which AOC has been using more recently, and I think that this is actually really sort of effective. So I want to share this tactic with you guys so you can sort of understand it and maybe use it in your own life. But AOC has been pointing out how many wealthy suburbs already have defunded the police in many respects. When you look at the budgets of wealthy suburbs, they've already defunded the police, and they fund things like education, like housing, like healthcare, way, way more than many of the big cities. So AOC's saying that we should frame this idea of defunding the police as, look, we just want to do what wealthy suburbs, what wealthy communities already do, because wealthy communities, guess what? They don't need to have a ton of police officers. I've said it on this channel many, many times. Well-resourced communities do not need strict policing. Communities that have all their needs met, communities that have great schools, great public education so that people have an opportunity moving forward, Those communities don't need strict policing. Those communities that give people forgiveness, that give people grace when they make mistakes, as opposed to hard line, oh, you did a bad thing, we're going to punish you, we're going to punish you. Those communities that enact grace, that enact forgiveness in their policies, especially towards young people, those are the communities that, again, they spend the most on education, on housing, on healthcare, and they don't have a ton of money going to police. I want to show you one example. This is of Fairfax County, in fact, where I live. Now, I didn't necessarily grow up in Fairfax County, but I do live here now, and I did work for their government for a little bit of time there. You can see here, funding for schools, over 50% of funding for schools. And I will say, Fairfax County public schools are some of the best in the nation. And by some metrics, you could even argue that Fairfax County public schools are the best K through 12 public education system in the world. Some people will make that argument. So, I mean, it's absolutely astounding, not just, the quality of our education here in Fairfax County, but also just, how much money is being spent on schools. And I'll tell you what, actually, I mentioned that I was working in Fairfax County government for a little bit there. I remember the debates were always about school funding. It was always, well, we want more money going to schools. That was the thing that everybody was fighting on. Right? They were like, we want more money going to schools. Because, I was mostly an intern there. And, so they had me answering the phone and doing all that kind of stuff there. And I was answering the phones and while they were trying to assemble the budget and stuff, basically everyone was calling saying, we want more money going to schools, more money going to schools. Make sure that we want this tax implemented so that school funding can go up. Like everyone wanted more money for schools. That was the important part. That was the thing that everybody knew was incredibly important. And so the idea is the values of a community, a community that really values education, that really values healthcare. Those are the kinds of communities that exceed and that excel here. And so you can see here, when you look at public safety, and by the way, that's not even the whole, like police department is actually just a portion of that 11.9% there. So, there's other aspects of public safety than just police here. But you can see here, health and welfare, 11%. So nearly the same amount of money being spent on health and welfare as is spent on the entire public safety budget, which is even more than just the police budget. So, that's just an instance there where, again, you compare those numbers to New York City, where youth, housing, healthcare, homelessness combined is less than the budget for the NYPD. So, this is just an example of, sort of a suburb area where, in some sense, you might be able to argue that Fairfax County already defunded the police. Now, personally, my view is, look, I think, there's still room to go even here in Fairfax County. But my point here is this: let's shift the values, right? Let's build up communities so that we're more interested in focusing on investments for education, on healthcare, on housing, on food assistance, the things that actually prevent crime from occurring in the first instance. Let's provide opportunities to young people so that people don't get ever sucked into crime. So then you don't need police officers, right? That should be the long-term goal. Even if you're sitting here like, well, I don't want to cut back on police funding, can we at least agree that the long-term goal of things should be to make sure that we don't have a need for police in the first instance. We might disagree, you and I might disagree on the things that would reduce the need for crime, but could we at least try to think about the things, think about the methods, think about the kinds of institutions, things that we could invest in which reduce crime from ever occurring? I mean, that seems, at least to me, that just seems like common sense. Let's do that. Let's go about that. And the most common sense way to do that, I would argue, is just to defund the police. Take the money from the police department, shift it over to those resources, to those institutions which prevent crime from ever occurring. Right? That way you don't have to talk about taxes. You don't have to have that, controversial debate about taxes. Because I will say, in Fairfax County, taxes are still controversial, even though it is a pretty wealthy county. Although people actually, it depends, right? Like one of the weird things that I will say about, Fairfax County government is that if you implement a tax and then tagline it specifically, okay, this is where the money is going, and if it's to education or something like that, people are actually much more willing to support a tax as opposed to like a blank tax. Okay, we're going to increase the budget. If you tell people, okay, we're increasing taxes and this is exactly where the money's going, people are, much more willing to support increases in taxes. So that's just an interesting thing to observe here. But Anyway, let's talk a little bit about some of the general arguments, or general themes, I should say, when it comes to, the idea of defunding the police. So in general, I've seen 2, maybe 3, depending how you want to break it out, sort of meta arguments for why we should defund the police. On one hand, there's kind of, the sort of idealist meta argument for defunding the police. This argument goes something along the lines of, we want to get rid of that sort of neoconservative idea which treats all social issues as finally criminal problems. Okay, so there's some kind of socially deviant behavior going on. Let's send in the police and let's criminalize that behavior. Let's arrest them, let's fine them, or what have you, handcuff them, use some kind of violent action of the state in order to suppress that socially deviant behavior. Maybe we should shift that mindset away. And so the thought is, if by defunding police, if again, budgets are the sort of, priorities of a community instantiated, if you shift the budget around to remove a little bit of policing and fund things like education, like housing, like healthcare, then hopefully you can start to sort of shift that messaging, shift the ideas, shift the sort of mental models that people go into the world with to, not just immediately associate social problems with criminal problems, right? So that's the kind of idealist arguments that you hear floating around. There's different variations of the idealist arguments, some more strong than others, et cetera, et cetera. But then there's also the sort of what I might call a pragmatist argument for defunding the police. And this goes something along the lines of, police have so much leverage, so much power in our local communities, right? I mean, they get so much funding and they have all these police unions backing them, that even when you try to implement democratic reform, it oftentimes doesn't get enacted because, a lot of people sit around talking, well, why not just reform the police? Why not just do this, that, and the other thing to the police departments? And then, that'll be that. Let's reduce the number of people who get killed. And I think there's at least 2 problems with that view. The first of which is that maybe we should start to think of, police killings as just the outburst of a deeper problem, right? As opposed to thinking of it as the problem itself. Let's think about why police killings even occur in the first case. And so, banning various kinds of tactics, putting on body cams, et cetera, maybe that's just putting a Band-Aid on what is finally a bullet hole. And let's really try to fix the problem itself. But when it comes to this idea, the sort of pragmatic approach in defunding police is that, you think about it, for instance, and what have we seen? Well, we've seen that banning tactics isn't particularly successful. Eric Garner, New York City, chokehold, banned. Eric Garner murdered. You look at George Floyd, the tactic which the guy was using, the kneel, which Derek Chauvin was using, the kneel, that was banned, and a chokehold was banned, a chokehold from the front of the neck, but, pressure on the back of the neck, the way that Derek Chauvin was on, technically, sort of, kind of, wasn't really banned. So it's a super weird situation. And by the way, the other thing that's super important here is that they oftentimes don't get enforced, man. Sometimes a county or a community passes body cam rules and the police union's like, nah, it doesn't really help us, et cetera, or the police chief or the sheriff just decides to not really enforce it. So, you end up in a situation across the country where the, local city council, the elected city council, the people themselves vote and they want various kinds of police reforms, and the police reforms don't end up getting enacted because police have so much entrenched power in America. They're like many little chieftains, right? That they have their own sort of independent rules, et cetera, that then they don't actually obey democratic authority. They don't actually listen to the will of the people. So the possibility, the thought of the pragmatic argument for defunding the police is, look, well, we've got to break them up, man. We've got to shrink their budget because the one democratic control which the city council, community, county board, et cetera, really does have, the one democratic check which, the community really does have over police is the budget. You cut their budget and they're weaker. That's the one thing, real clear, direct thing that democracy can really do, can really check when it comes to police departments, especially the really big police departments in places like New York City. The one thing that you really can do is cut their budget. So as opposed to implementing various kinds of reform, which again, oftentimes just get ignored. You have police officers just turning off their body cams, or you have, communities that just police departments which just decide not to really tell people to actually ban a tactic or tell people that they have to put on a body cam, and it's a disaster. It's really, really hard to actually implement reform. So the pragmatic argument is, well, we've got to defund police, or at least break them up, or do something like that, because they don't even listen to democracy. So if you're going to reform police, the first thing you have to do is defund them and then you can talk about reform, and then you can talk about reforming police. So it's really interesting. It's a really interesting divide. Now, there is a kind of empiricist argument as well. I don't know that that's maybe the best term for it. And, you know, this argument, they tend to focus on how, for instance, the number of police officers seems to have no correspondence to reducing violent crime. They might look, for instance, at the budget, as I was looking at here. So that's kind of like, you know, what some empiricist people might say, or an empiricist arguments. But the general arguments that you're floating around are, again, a kind of idealist argument or a kind of pragmatist argument. So anyway, just wanted to update you guys on that so you all knew what was going on when it comes to Bill de Blasio. We'll have to be watching closely in the next coming days and the next coming weeks to see what that actual budget cut to the NYPD looks like. Will it just be, you know, cutting around the edges, or will it be substantial enough to make some change? We'll have to see. We'll have to see. So, but anyway, that's the video for now. If you liked it, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button and consider subscribing. Thanks.